Good morning, or depending upon when you're watching this, good afternoon or even good evening. Last week we looked at the emergence of a prosperous, stable planter society in Virginia, increasingly dependent on slave labor. As we saw, Virginia had started out as depending more on indentured servants, but by the end of the 17th century it was turning into a slave-dependent society, one whose prosperity came by and large from the cultivation of tobacco. And we talked a lot about how tobacco shaped Virginian society, the impact that it had on the way planters thought about their role in society, and as we talked about, it also had an important implications for the way Virginians would view the British reforms that caused the imperial crisis that led to the American Revolution. Well, during our next discussion, we're going to be talking about New England and the villages that developed in New England, and the society quite different from Virginia in many ways that developed in the states to the east of the Hudson River. So we'll be talking about that on next Tuesday during the discussion. You'll find discussion questions, as always, in the discussion section of Blackboard, and they're two very important readings, one by Michael Zuckerman, posing the question about whether it makes sense to think of New England as a democracy in the decades before the American Revolution. As we'll see, democracy was a very loaded term in the 18th century, and it wasn't actually one with positive connotations. So be aware of that as you do the Zuckerman reading. If New England was a democracy, it was probably one more in practice rather than one that New Englanders actually would have used the word democracy to describe. Nonetheless, it's very egalitarian, in that way quite different from the society that developed in Virginia, although, as you'll see, and we'll talk about this during the discussion, it was also a hierarchically organized society, although oftentimes the hierarchy was within the paternalistic or patriarchal family, with a good deal of equality between the male heads of households. So keep your eye on that. So next week we'll be talking about a second area, very different from Virginia, but of course very important as well. And as we've already said, Virginia and Massachusetts together were the two principal leaders during the imperial crisis that led to the American Revolution. And together they supplied all the first five presidents, four of them coming from Virginia and one, John Adams, coming from Massachusetts. Well, today I want to talk about a third, you can't really call it a region, but a third kind of component of this overview that we've been doing of American society on the eve of the American Revolution. And that third category is the category of the port cities. These port cities were scattered up and down the eastern seaboard, from Charleston in South Carolina up to Boston in Massachusetts. Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was an important city. It was the main port for the colony of New Hampshire. And one of the things with all of these, there's always some kind of a paradox or a tension, a problem to be explained. And in the case of the port cities, the problem to be explained is that population-wise, they weren't all that significant. North America, I should say, on the eve of the Revolution was overwhelmingly rural. Only about 4 to 5% of British Americans lived in cities. In that way, it's very, very different from the world we live in today, when the vast majority of Americans either live in cities or in the suburbs and outlying exurban areas of cities. Massachusetts, to talk about Massachusetts is basically to talk about greater Boston. There are people from Massachusetts who live beyond that, but something like 2/3 of Massachusetts population lives either in Boston or within the larger conurbation. sort of the 495 Beltway. America in 1775, or if you want to take sort of 1750, which is the benchmark that we've been using, is very different. Only about, as I say, 4 to 5% of people live in cities. However, that 4 to 5% is hugely important. And one of the things I'll do, as always, I've got 3 parts to the lecture. First, in the overview, I'll talk about the role that the cities played. They're hugely important politically, economically, and culturally. Then I'll move on to looking a little more closely at one of their most important functions, and that is as engines of Anglicization and refinement, Part B, which you can see on the outline here. And then finally, talk about cities as important crucibles of change. And as we're going to see when we start looking at the origins of the revolution, it's really in the cities where the resistance to British taxation first takes hold. So again, a small segment of the American population, but a hugely important one. Final note before I get into the overview. I've broken this lecture up into 3 separate video recordings. You'll also see that in the email that I send out. So the first part will be Part A on the outline here. The second part will be Part B on the outline. And the third part will be Part C. Okay. Well, let me start with an overview of the key features of urban life in the colonies. You can see here on the slide the top 5 cities, the most populous cities in British America in 1775. The largest city on the eve of the American Revolution was by far Philadelphia at 40,000. It was followed by New York, which was growing and would eventually overtake Philadelphia in the early 19th century. At the time of the Revolution, New York had 25,000 inhabitants, followed by Boston, which was third in 1775 with 16,000. Interestingly, Boston had been the largest city in the 17th century, and as we'll see from our reading for the discussion, and I'll talk a little bit about this during the discussion as well. New England was very different from Virginia in that its settlement, the New Englanders did settle in towns and in the case of Boston City. So New England was the first region to really urbanize, though by the time of the Revolution, Philadelphia and New York were overtaking it. Another surprise on this list is Newport, Rhode Island, which is the 4th largest city at the time of the Revolution, with 12,000 inhabitants. It would be overtaken eventually by Providence, which is today the largest city in Rhode Island. Newport's sort of a quaint port. I'm not sure what the population now is. It's larger than 12,000, but it's hard to imagine that Newport was where it was at in 1775. And then the 5th largest city was Charleston, South Carolina, the capital city of South Carolina and the principal port, also with 12,000 inhabitants. And circling back to a point that we mentioned on last Thursday, all of these cities, including Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, were diverse places. They tended to be religiously diverse, with an array of different religions. Insofar as there's a Catholic presence in British America at the time of the Revolution, it tends to be in these cities. And they're also racially diverse. There are significant free black populations, particularly in Philadelphia and Charleston. But New York, Boston, and Newport also had black populations as well. And I believe I mentioned that New Hampshire's black population at the time of the Revolution was largely in Portsmouth. There were some blacks in rural areas, but largely we're talking about an urban population when we talk about African North. Now, as you will have noted, these cities were small by 21st century standards, or 20th century standards for that matter. And they're also small when compared to the largest cities in Europe. And here we see the Philadelphia skyline in 1778. At the time of the Revolution, London probably had a population of about 500,000. And there are actually cities in Spanish America that are much larger than these as well. I'm not positive what the population of Mexico City was, but it was certainly in the six figures, well over 100,000. So that there are other places that are much more heavily urbanized. However, if we sort of bracket off megacities like London or Paris or Rome, for that matter, also very populous, or Mexico City here in the Americas, these are significant areas, significant cities. Philadelphia, which we're looking at right here, colored engraving from 1778. Philadelphia, with a population of 40,000, was compared favorably with second-tier cities in the British Isles. Cities like Dublin in Ireland, Edinburgh, Glasgow, York in England. These also would have been cities with, around 40,000 inhabitants. So while Philadelphia is small by modern standards, it's a fairly major urban area, particularly if we regard London as an outlier just because it is so large. Now, one of the interesting things about these cities is that they, as I've indicated, they're cities that are in an overwhelmingly rural area. Often the cities themselves retain elements of the countryside. In New York, for example, and here we see New York. This is the image on the upper right here is New York in 1797. This would be down on the lower tip of Manhattan, the area sort of south of Wall Street. And New York actually was a walled city for much of the 18th century, as it had been since the 17th century, and Wall Street was where the wall was. North of Wall Street, a lot of New York was still quite rural. And if you've been to Central Park in New York, you get an idea of what a lot of Manhattan still looked like at the time of the Revolution. And even areas that were starting to urbanize oftentimes had farms in them. Down in the lower left-hand corner, we see a map of Boston in 1814. Boston beyond the neck, and one of the interesting things, if you look at that map carefully, you can see that it shows the area, Boston as it actually existed in 1814. It's the shaded area, and I'm not sure if you can see this cursor doing this. I'll have to review it to see if it is, but it's the area around the shading, and you can sort of see the docks. That's Boston as it existed in 1814. And then you can see the area sort of extending, particularly on the left-hand side. That's the Back Bay heading out toward the Fens. That was all filled in. That's Boston as it would exist by 1880. Now, a lot of Boston in the area sort of the neck and in what is today downtown was quite urban by the time of the Revolution. But even in there, you would have found sort of still some small fields, areas where animals were kept. So even in the most urban parts, these cities would have looked quite different from what we think of as cities today. Another point worth noting is that cities tended to be pretty unhygienic places. None of them had sewage systems yet. Basically, when people got rid of the sewage, they dumped it out the window into the gutters. One of the first things that travelers visiting cities would comment on was how bad they smelled. And of course, the transportation was not provided by internal combustion powered vehicles, but instead horses. So that there's a lot of cow dung or horse dung that you have to watch out for when you're walking through the streets. So, okay. Well, what I want to do is talk about some of the principal things that these cities provided. First off, they are all of them owed their dynamism principally to commerce. And remember, one of the things we've talked about, and I mentioned it last week with Virginia, is that this is a staple economy. That British America in 1750 and right up through the Revolution. The prosperity of America came by and large from producing goods for export to Britain and Europe, and they're staple goods. That is, goods that haven't been that extensively refined. And a lot of this commerce was run by merchants residing in these large port cities. The size of this trade grew dramatically during the 18th century. And you get, actually, let me go back here just a minute to Philadelphia. One of the things that you note about this, the image of Philadelphia here, is the maritime character of Philadelphia's waterfront. Philadelphia, of course, isn't on the ocean, but it is accessible to ocean-going ships coming up the Delaware Bay and River. It's actually, I believe, still tidal in Philadelphia. So this image captures the extent to which Philadelphia was a maritime port and how important that seaborne trade was to Philadelphia. Well, just to review, we talked about this, and there may even be a slide in one of the earlier PowerPoints, but let me go over it again. The staple economy, this isn't an exhaustive list, there are other goods on this, but tobacco from Virginia, we talked a lot about that. Wheat, major and increasingly important product coming from Philadelphia, New York as well. These are Pennsylvania in particular, though Maryland, Northern Virginia, and parts of New York and New Jersey, very important as kind of the breadbasket, sending wheat both to Europe. There's growing demand for it in England, which was well on its way to becoming a predominantly urban society, and also down to the West Indies, a lot of provisioning trade going this way. Fish, that was an important commodity, especially from New England. Then as now, New England very important as a fishing center. Timber, a lot of timber produced here in New Hampshire, also in Maine, which at this point was part of Massachusetts, northern New England, already producing timber, a lot of that for export. North Carolina is another center of the timber trade. Rice, rice is a very important commodity produced in South Carolina, in the Low Country, a lot of that going out of Charleston. Indigo, also from South Carolina, as well as the West Indies. And finally, sugar. And we've just been sort of alluding to the West Indies, though they continue to be an important part of our story, and sugar was really a big West Indian port. So all of this, this staple trade really helped to sustain the cities, and it's important to understand that that's one of the things that that the cities did. Well, the cities are also hugely important as political centers. In a lot of British America, you could live an entire life and not really encounter anybody from Britain or any representatives of the British government. I've already sort of hinted at this in the first lecture when we talked about the British Empire. America is a very lightly governed, the American colonies, rather, are very lightly governed at the time of the American Revolution. That starts to change in the 1760s, but before the 1760s, there's not a big British presence here. The exception to that are the cities. It is in the cities where the British Empire and government does have a major presence. And also, if you were an ambitious young man, and we have a picture here of the most ambitious young men of them all, Benjamin Franklin, painted in 1767 at the height of his powers. If you were an ambitious young man like Franklin, the cities were where you went. And if we were in class, I'd ask for a show of hands if anyone has read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography or excerpts from it. You'll know about it from your class with me if you took 405 with me. But Ben Franklin, of course, actually from Boston, you may have seen the obelisk that he built to his parents once he became rich, but he's from a very humble background. And he is apprenticed to his brother, James Franklin, in his print shop. They quarrel. Benjamin doesn't like the terms of service, and he ends up fleeing his apprenticeship for Philadelphia. That's where he goes, the largest and most dynamic city already in the 1720s. And it's in Philadelphia where Benjamin Franklin makes the connections necessary to set up his own print shop. He actually goes to London for a while to learn the printing trade. Philadelphia becomes very important as the basis of the printing empire that he creates, this newspaper culture. And it's also in Philadelphia where Franklin makes the connections that enables him to become Postmaster General of the British Empire, which he is appointed to in the 1740s. And through this sort of combination of the printing business and his political connections, he becomes a very wealthy and influential figure. And here we see Franklin in 1767 as a successful businessman and politician. And Franklin it plays a huge role in British politics, not just as Postmaster General. He's very important in helping to organize some of the British campaigns during the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. He's also the Pennsylvania agent to the government in London. He ends up spending a fair bit of time in London as well. All of that he's able to do because of his position in Philadelphia politics. And in the reading for this week by Jerry Daniel, you'll see that the Wentworth oligarchy, Benning Wentworth and eventually his son, or his nephew, pardon me, John Wentworth, their basis of power is in Portsmouth. And it couldn't have been otherwise, because Portsmouth is where there's direct access to British officials. That's where the British customs officials are. That's where the British Navigation Acts are administered. It's also where the British Navy, which is the most important defensive part of the British Empire, is based in the years before the American Revolution. All of that you would encounter. The other thing to note about the port cities is that they are, without exception, the capitals of the colonies that they are situated in. And in many colonies, they become sort of the social centers of those colonies. Now, Virginia, which we talked about last week, is a bit of an outlier in this regard. A lot of power in Virginia continues to reside on the farms and plantations that the great planters built. But certainly here in New Hampshire, and this is true in Philadelphia, New York, South Carolina as well, it's actually in the cities where the ruling cabals, or the oligarchies, and that's a term I mentioned on last week, and you'll see that Jerry Daniel. And one of the things that happens because of the creation of these urban-based oligarchies, there are two things. On one hand, political power within the colonies was largely exercised within these urban-based oligarchies, and that's really where power resided. And partly as a result of that, it was not unusual for tensions to develop between outlying farmers and the inhabitants of towns living outside these principal urban centers. And Jerry Daniel does a good job of talking about that. Benning Wentworth has to manage relations with the western towns, and oftentimes he does a pretty good job of handling that. But there's always the possibility for conflict. And his great opponents during in the lead up to the American Revolution, actually in many ways going back into the 1740s and 50s, were the Gilmans of Exeter, New Hampshire. And in the colonial era, Exeter was the western reaches of New Hampshire, and outlying, and a lot of New Hampshire politics can be sort of understood as a tension between those areas. And one of the clearest signs of this is that after the Revolution, as the power of these oligarchs and oligarchies is challenged, and in many cases overthrown, a lot of capitals of what had been colonies and now states are moved west. In the case of New Hampshire, the capital is eventually moved from Portsmouth to what is today Concord, New Hampshire. It's actually the town of Rumford in the colonial era. So too in my own home state, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia is no longer the capital of Pennsylvania. It hasn't been since the Revolution. Instead, the capital's moved to Harrisburg. Boston is very unusual in this regard in that it continued to be the capital of Massachusetts, but that's unusual. But in the colonial era, the cities are the real political centers of these. Well, the final role that these cities played, the first two being sort of economic hubs and political centers, the third and final really important role that cities played was as cultural centers. They are real crucibles of cultural change, and they are, for example, I talked a little bit last week. I introduced the term Anglicization. That is the attempt to be as English as possible. A lot of that is brokered through these port towns. If you wanted to know what the latest fashions were in England, there's no better place to go than to New York or Boston or even some of the smaller ports. I would include Williamsburg and Alexandria, Virginia, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This is where people could go to get the latest fashions. They're also the places where the innovations of cultural change tended to first appear. They are, for example, where the first theaters are opened in the colonies. And here we see in the upper right hand an image of Congress Hall and the new theater in Philadelphia from the 1790s. Again, this is taken after the Revolution, but both of these are pre-revolutionary buildings and probably would have looked like this in the 1770s on the eve of the Revolution. And theaters are particularly important because, and again, if we were in class, I would turn to you and ask you to think about why theaters might be so important. And sometimes they're quite controversial, particularly up here in New England. And in New England, theaters are controversial because they tend to be centers of imagination, oftentimes associated with morals and ideas that look a little suspect if you're a Puritan. Insofar as there are red light districts in British America, they're in the towns, and when they're in the towns, they're usually gathered around the theaters. Prostitution and theaters kind of tended to go together. So theaters are not terribly popular anywhere for that reason. And they're also real engines of refinement. It takes spare capital. Spending money to be able to go and see a play in the cities. And by the 1750s, all of the major ports, including Boston, had built theaters, and of course the plays that Americans tended to see in those theaters tended to be produced, having been written in Europe or particularly in Britain, in London. London was the real center of the theater throughout the British Empire, and those plays would have been staged in these theaters. They're very important. Towns are also really important as the sites of newspapers. And one of the great innovations of the early 18th century was the inexpensive newspaper. And here we see on the left the Pennsylvania Gazette, one of Benjamin Franklin's newspapers. This is from 1730. It's actually, if you can see, if you pause maybe or take a careful look, you'll see that it's from January 12th, 1730-31. Until the 1750s, the colonies were on the Julian calendar rather than the Gregorian calendar, which meant that New Year's Day was actually April 1st. That's when we remember April's Fool's Day. It's commemorating the old start of the new year. but most of Europe was on the Gregorian calendar, and so that from January to through March, Americans, like Britons as well, would date things, they would give 2 years. So this is actually, if this were today, that would be January 12th, 1731. Anyway, sidebar. The newspapers became hugely important because they are ways of diffusing information beyond the principal port cities out into the countryside. And I mentioned last week, but it's worth noting again, that Franklin is the great entrepreneur of newspapers. By the time he retired from the newspaper business, he continued to own it, but he turned it over to others in the 1740s. He had a stake in something like half the newspapers throughout North America. He doesn't control it, but he's sort of the Rupert Murdoch, if you will, of the newspaper industry in America at the time, in the colonial era. And Franklin, a lot of these newspapers, they're full of mercantile news. They reproduce public speeches. In this case, on this page, what we see is the speech of the governor to the Pennsylvania Assembly. It's printed on the front page of the newspaper. But they might have news about battles in Europe, doings in Britain, sort of interesting events that might have happened in the West Indies. All of that is here in the newspapers. And these newspapers circulate far beyond the ports where they were published. And so the ports become engines for drawing people throughout the colonies into the cultural and imaginative world, if you will, of the British Empire. So cities are really important as conduits of information. They're also important as conduits of innovation. The first public lighting, done, I believe, by whale oil, was set up in Philadelphia in the 1750s. And again, Benjamin Franklin is hugely important in this as well. I hate to overplay Franklin, but he's the man before the Revolution. On the eve of the Revolution, he is far and away the most famous figure in America. They're also where some of the earliest hospitals are located. And again, Pennsylvania Hospital, founded in Philadelphia by Benjamin Franklin, or a group that Franklin was a member of. Very important in this regard. And also, most of the colleges in America at the time of the Revolution are founded in the port city. And here we see two colleges, Harvard College, an engraving in the upper left from 1725, and that's, of course, well, it's in Cambridge, across the river from Boston, and King's College, today known as Columbia University in New York City. This is an engraving from the 1770s. If you see the caption, it's entitled Old King's College, so this is probably not an engraving from the 1770s. It would have been taken. It's done probably from some kind of original engraving, I would guess sometime in the 19th century. Anyway, most colleges are actually urban institutions, and so if you were going to go to college, you were probably going to end up in one of these towns. There are two notable exceptions to this urban trend. One, the College of New Jersey, what is today Princeton University. The other, Dartmouth College, founded in 1768 here in New Hampshire. And both of those were deliberately set outside of urban spaces. In the case of Dartmouth, they actually, over in Hanover, which is just Nowheresville, in 1768. Some of us would say it still is Nowheresville. The Dartmouth's motto in Latin, Vox Clamantes Deserte, a voice crying out in the wilderness, the motto of St. John the Baptist, and it's out there for missionary purposes. In the case of Princeton, the fact that it was out in, just set in a field somewhere, that's part of the purpose, but this was also seen as a bit of a problem. And when One of Princeton's early presidents, John Witherspoon from Scotland, showed up. He was very disturbed by the fact that here's this college in the middle of a cow field, and so he decided to dignify it with the Latin word for field, which he called campus. Going forward, it wasn't unusual for colleges and universities to be set outside of cities, and when they were, they tended to be situated on what were called campuses. But in the early days, colleges tended to be built around urban quadrangles, and oftentimes the space where they were built was called a yard. And to this day, Harvard still talks about its yard, and what you're looking at here in 1725 is Harvard Yard. Okay, well, I'll wrap up. This is the end of Part 1 and Part A. For the next part of the lecture, please go to Part 2, and I will continue with talking a little bit more about some of the complexities and twists and turns of Anglo-Saxon